we look to spend the day in Genesis again. Because Genesis begins it all, and I'd sing it for you, but I shouldn't. It's a great song, though. Genesis begins it all. You should Google it. It's the Fabulous Bentley Brothers, which actually Rhett and Link, if you follow them on Facebook or YouTube, rather. They're a pair of comedians. But they participated in a series. How many of you remember or know of VeggieTales?
Yes.
So VeggieTales was created by a guy named Phil Vischer. It started off as his project, became somebody else's. He kind of lost control of it. He didn't like what it became, but it was no longer his to say. So once he got himself disentangled from VeggieTales, he created a new, actually he's got a new subscription channel online called Jelly Telly. And it's, you pay to get in, but it's all Christian-based cartoon content. And he's a pretty creative guy. But then a couple years ago, he started a new series called What's in the Bible. And his goal was to teach the entire Bible at a level that the kids could understand and get the meta-narrative kind of thing. They just last week or the week before released the last disc of Revelation. So it's 9 DVDs. He gets through the entire Bible, and it's a mixture of puppets and animation and some live stuff, and incredibly funny, very well done. And I've seen the first couple DVDs. Did a very good job and a very accurate job. There's no no more purple Kool-Aid. If you'll think back to VeggieTales, as they were getting ready to walk around Babylon, not purple Kool-Aid, it was Slurpees. As they were going around Jericho, the people who lived in Jericho were dumping Slurpees on the children of Israel. Those kind of things that probably just didn't happen are gone. And so they did a really good job. I'm anxious to see Revelation. They did a good job working through the law, which you think about when you get Exodus and then into Leviticus and Numbers. A lot of that is tough going, but they did a good job with it, I thought, and answered to why it might be important. So if you ever want a good, accessible, kind of course on the entire narrative of the Bible, I think that's one of the best, even though it's made for kids. Maybe because it's made for kids. So it's all, bottom shelf stuff, but it's good. I enjoyed it. So anyway, Genesis chapter 15. Why don't we start this morning with our memory verse, which is Hebrews 11:8. So if you need it, turn to it. I don't have this thing going, so. It's like, hey, I was eating that.
He is a cranky boy today.
All right, so Hebrews 11:8. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. So we have another week or so to get that under our belt. And then when we hit April, we'll start a new verse. So just to kind of... one of the things I found, we don't talk a lot about Bible memory, and we probably don't do nearly enough of it either. But one of the things that I found, because I struggle like you, as a kid I could memorize anything. Now there's just must be so much stuff up there. Stuff falls out, it just doesn't work. But what I found is an effective tool for me is to handwrite the verse on an index card and then just carry the index card around and read it as the day goes on. One, just the discipline of writing it out. Writing it so you can read it, which may mean several copies for some of us, and then just carry it around because it'll fit in your pocket, fold it up, whatever. It's not like you have to preserve it, but you can pull it out, take a look at it, a couple times a day, and eventually that'll just stick. So something to work on. Scripture memory is an important part and an important discipline, really for all of us to continue to work on. It gets harder the older you get, I think. At least it has for me. Premature senility did not help either, but it's an important thing for us to work on. So Genesis chapter 15, we're kind of shifting gears a little bit. If you'll remember last week, was kind of war and peace. You had this whole armed conflict going on. We get back to a little more normal stuff that we'd have expected. Abraham, faith and mysticism and obedience and worship and weird. All of this rolls into Genesis 15. So I want to begin in verse 1. I want to get down to verse 21 this morning is my goal, and I think, which is like the whole chapter. So I think we can get there. Hopefully, we'll see. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward."
But Abram said, "Lord God, what give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?"
Okay. Okay, go ahead, 3, then I'll comment. Sorry.
Then Abram said, "Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir."
Okay, so we're introduced to a kind of a recurring theme in Abraham's life. This, he's already been told that he's going to have a family. God's already given that to him a bit. Years have gone on. Abraham and Sarah are both getting older, and this is starting to become kind of a pronounced thing for Abraham. He's wealthy. Lots of cattle, lots of, everything, any measure of wealth in his culture, he had quite a bit of it. God, what am I going to do with all my stuff? Who's going to get this? Who's going to inherit my stuff? Who's going to inherit your promises? Who's going to, you told me that this is going to be my land. Well, who's going to inherit the land? I got nothing in the kids department. And so Abraham is thinking, humanly speaking, in his culture, in his custom, one born in his house could be his heir. And so he asks about this guy, Eliezer, could he be the one? Interesting, he calls him Eliezer of Damascus, and yet says that he was born in his own house. So it's kind of an interesting, title that he would have, yet one born in my own house could be my heir. And so the idea being, this guy, despite his title, was actually born in Abraham's house, was, the son of one of his servants. And so he had the right legally to say, I'm going to take this person that was born in my house. He may not be my biological child, but he was born in my house, and I can nominate, I can dictate that he's going to be my heir and take over my household. And so this is what Abraham's trying to figure out. He's trying to help God out, because that's what we do, because God obviously needs our help. That's a joke. So he's trying to help God out, trying to figure, all right, and he's trying to, wrap his head around, and we do that. And I'm not belittling Abram for this process, because, we do, and we should, look at the situations in our life and apply our wisdom, our culture, our passion, our strength, our resources on the issues in our life. God never said, don't use your brain, don't use your muscles, don't, never said any of that. And so it's not a bad thing that he's doing. He's just looking at the situations realistically as he can, going, probably not going to happen for me. So what about if I pick this guy? I could legally not, appoint him as heir. God, of course, had a different idea, and so we pick that up in verse 4.
Towards the heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be.
Abram put his trust in the Lord, and because of this, the Lord was pleased with him and accepted him.
Okay, so God's idea was, Abraham, no, the person who is going to inherit your house, who's going to inherit my promise, who's going to inherit your land, all this stuff, is going to be biologically your child. Which, as Abraham got older, this is, seems increasingly less likely. And yet, Abraham, we were told, believed God. Abraham said, okay, God, that's what you say is going to happen, then that's what's going to happen. He didn't, And it's interesting that God said, now go and look at the stars, and if you can count them, that's how many kids you're going to have. We don't want to, I could imagine somebody getting real hardcore literal and going out and literally trying to count the number of stars, and then did that really mesh up with, our approximate population totals for all the Jews who've ever been born? That really isn't the point to say here's a concrete number. But when you think about if you're in an area with very little light pollution at night, and you look up, there's just an uncountable number of stars. Millions that you see, and it's just, all over. Right, exactly. And so it just keeps going. And that's the idea. This is a large number. And that's what God was getting at Abraham. You're going to have a ton of kids. You're going to have a ton of people are going to come from your line, your biological line. And you think about it, Abraham, we tend to sometimes focus Abraham and the Jews, and yet Abraham is also the father of much of the rest of the Middle East. The Muslim world coming from Ishmael, who also came from Abraham. And we get, Abraham, after Sarah died, remarried and had a whole mess of kids with his next wife. And who knows where they ran off to, because the narrative of Scripture didn't really chase them around because they weren't the focus. But that there was a lot there that God was promising him. So he was just looking at a large number, and Abraham believed him. And then I think it's a little funky from here, so we'll go into verse 7.
And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it.
And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it?
So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon.
Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two, down the middle, and placed each piece opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds in two.
And when the vultures came down on their carcasses, Abram drove them away.
All right, so let me stop there. Weird? I mean, there's not a grill in sight. And so when you start carving animals outside and there's no grill, it's strange. And what we're seeing here, and we'll continue to see this, is this is a cultural norm for Abraham. For us, this just looks like weird. That God is preparing to formalize a covenant treaty with Abraham. And so that's where we're starting down into this path. So Abraham's question is, Lord, how, you've said I'm going to inherit this land. How do I know I'm going to inherit this land? I don't have any kids. How do I know that all of this is going to happen? And so God says, let me make a covenant with you. Let me make and treaty is probably, or contract, are the concepts that we know of that come closest to this. Where you have, usually parties would stipulate, I'm going to do this, you're going to do this, and I'm going to pay this, and I'm going to pay that, and it sets out the terms. Is what a covenant is. In its broadest rudimentary strokes. And so God says, let us make a covenant. So Abraham takes these animals that God told him to, he cuts them in half, lays them apart from each other, puts some birds out there, and then he's having to protect this because the vulture's like, hey, no grill, this must be for us. And so they start coming by. So we'll keep going in verse 12.
And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him.
The Lord said unto him, your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land. They will be slaves there, and they will be treated cruelly for 400 years.
And also the nations whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions.
Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age.
But in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
And it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven, and a burning torch that passed between those pieces.
On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I have given this land, from the rivers of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates."
The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. I think it just saved everybody that one. So there's a couple things that happen in this, this process of making a covenant. First thing that happens, Abraham's out there and he's trying to keep the birds, the vultures away from stuff, and what is described here is almost like a trance-like state that Abraham ends up in. He, probably naturally falls asleep. As it gets dark, you're hanging around outside in the dark, and busy day, cutting things up and chasing things away, and he falls asleep, and he begins to have this vision of the future, and God is speaking to, working with Abraham, and so part of what God is going to give to Abraham is a picture of what the future looks like. And so he tells Abraham, look, your children are going to be strangers in a strange land. They're going to go to Egypt, and they're going to be in bondage, and they're going to be there for 400 years, but then they'll come back here. That's an interesting, kind of this. You're going to have kids. You're going to have a lot of kids, and they're going to be slaves for a couple centuries. But he gives him, a picture of what the future looks like for his children going forward. And I think Abraham may have seen even further than that. This is the central part of it, as he's trying to describe what he's seen here. And then the grill shows up, which is nice. You get, this smoking oven and the oven and the torch. And this is Abraham's dreaming and he's seeing this going on kind of the same time. The way the covenant was, and we started this, he puts the animals out either side, and what would normally happen is once you've agreed to terms, the two parties making the covenant would walk through this gauntlet of carved up animals side by side, and this was the formalization of this particular covenant. And so they would walk together through this, and that was the finality, the formality of adopting whatever the covenant was. But when you see this, what is glaring about this is who didn't walk through the aisle of carnage. Anyone? Who did not walk through it? Huh? Abram did not. That's correct. And that's significant because what it means now is this is not a conditional covenant. This is an unconditional covenant because God is now saying, I am going to make a covenant with you. There is no expectations on your part. I am walking through as the only party bearing any conditions. And so God walks through, and it's an unconditional covenant that he makes with Abraham. At this point, God has bound himself by his own word, and Abraham needs to do nothing. And that's the significance of that. It's weird when you look at it, but this is normal for Abram's culture in the day. And so God says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. I'm going to ratify this covenant by myself. It's an unconditional covenant. I'm the only one who has any conditions to meet in this covenant. And so he does that, and he goes through. So it's a very interesting, although, granted, you read it through and you're like, okay, what is and there's imagery here, there's symbolism here, other than the grill, God walks through and lets Abraham know this is what's going to be, this is what's going to happen. And then he gives him a description of the land. So there are several components to this promise. There is that future promise, you're going to have a lot of kids. There's a future promise, your children are going to go into slavery in Egypt, and they're going to be there for 400 years. There is the promise of the unconditional nature of this, but then there's the promise of the geography of the land. And so he describes this for him. And if you have a map in your Bible, in the back, you can look at it. I have one printed here. It's not the most, I guess it's helpful, but, and so he describes the land, the river of Egypt. Anybody want to take a stab at it? The Nile, right? That was like the river in Egypt, right? And so God says, so your southern border is going to be the Nile River, going up along the Mediterranean, which forms their western border. And then on the eastern border is the river Euphrates. You think about modern Israel, it's the Jordan River. The Euphrates River is a couple hundred miles east. And God says, that's going to be your eastern border, your northern border, the mountainous region up there. And so he gives them this geography. Here is the land that I am promising to give to you, Abraham, and to your seed. What's most interesting about that particular description is it has never happened yet. You think about modern day Israel, its borders and boundaries. Even if you were to put the West Bank and the Gaza Strip back into Israel where they belong, Israel has never possessed the land that God said, this is going to be your land. And I use the word yet because I believe firmly that it will one day belong to Israel. But you think about the Egyptians would take issue with them having their southern border down on the Nile River. Because right now, that border is closer into the Sinai Peninsula, and they're still arguing over who owns what there. I mean, it's desert. Who cares who owns what? You start heading east into the Euphrates. There are several, countries, Iraq, Iran, that would have problems with that because it means it's not their property. They would take issue with that. Extending north further than the boundaries of Israel ever got as well. Different areas that were there, and God said, "This is the land that is that I'm giving to you." And so, from a kind of a national perspective, Israel never fully occupied that territory. They came closest. They came closest under King Saul. David ushered in kind of the golden era for the Jewish country, for Israel. Saul expanded that to its largest point, but even under Saul, they didn't occupy south as far as the Nile. They did not occupy east as far as the Euphrates. They did not occupy north as far. And so even in that, they never fully occupied the land that God said, this is the land I'm going to promise you. When we look into the future and you start reading over into the book of the Revelation, God establishes, his world headquarters in Jerusalem, starts governing the world through the nation of Israel. What we're going to find there is finally Israel is going to own her borders as God promised. And so this is something that still, though it's in the book of Genesis very early on, has never yet come to fruition. Doesn't mean it won't. It just hasn't yet. A lot of things in the Bible that way. And so it'll do that. The significance of that particular piece of real estate, though, can't be understated. God's plan, and we'll see this as you get into Exodus and further on, God's plan was for Israel to be a nation of priests. God's plan was never for Israel to be completely closed off from the world. His plan was for them to be a witness to the world. But unlike us, because Christians have kind of like the same mission today that God gave the Israelites then, the difference being God has told us to go into all the world, and God gave them a piece of property where all the world would come to them. That particular piece of real estate, if you look at it on a larger map, what you'll find is Europe, Africa, Asia, all meet right in Israel. So if you're going anywhere in the world, from anywhere else in the world, you're going through Israel. All the major caravan routes coming from Asia, Europe, or in Africa through same thing coming up from Africa, Europe. Where you're going in that area of the world, you're going through Israel. And so God's saying, I want you to be a witness to the world, and I'm going to bring them to you. His plan was to know him, to be able to speak him and represent him as they came. Did that happen? Not so much. God's so this is incredible. It's why it has been in a state of conflict for thousands of years, because it's single strategic property, because of the major. So God says to Abraham, covenant, here's the land I'm giving you. Here is, the children I'm giving you. Here's a glimpse of what the future of your family looks like. There's going to be so many, though you can't count them. And he says, I'm just going to take care of this. It's all coming through. And so we refer to all this together as the Abrahamic covenant. And this gets stated several times throughout the life of Abraham. He says, I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth through you, and so all this. But these are the particular terms of the covenant that he makes with Abraham. He'll remind him in several places of this covenant that he has made with Abraham. And we'll see as we go through his life. But these are the terms. And God said, here's the covenant, here's the terms, and I'm going to bind myself by it. No expectations of you. And so, Abraham's concern throughout the beginning of this is just that, Lord, I don't have any kids. And God says, I got it covered in a big way, because obviously, if you're only going to have a handful of kids, you don't need, hundreds, thousands of square miles of property. And yet that's what God promised to Abraham. So in a very real way, he takes this fear that Abraham had in childbearing and he nullifies it. And Abraham took this covenant and believed it. And so we find here, we're going to find it again in the book of James. James refers back to this section, says, look, Abraham believed God, and God accounted it to him for righteousness. And it wasn't something he did because there was no expectation of Abraham doing anything. And that's the argument, faith works. And James says, no, faith, it's belief. It's what you do, it's what you believe. God made a great him. He no expectation of doing, just in believing. So that's Genesis 15. Any questions? A couple minutes. Yeah.